What will you do if you suddenly find yourself in a situation where you've lost everything you had and you don't know how to get it back? They're gone, but maybe there's still a chance to make things right. Make sure you don't miss the most important moment of this story. I turned onto our quiet street, stopped in front of our house, and pressed the button to open the garage door. Normally, I'd hear it humming and lifting, but this time, a sudden anxiety pricked me. It occurred to me that it was Friday, which meant my husband, Brian, might have taken our children, Connor and Grace, out for a late dinner. Of course, there was nothing unusual about that. Yet in that moment, I felt a hint of unease, as if some hidden part of me suspected things weren't as smooth as they seemed. I carefully pulled the car inside and noticed that Brian's pickup truck wasn't parked in its usual spot. Half of the garage was an empty void. I tried to smile, reminding myself that the idea of Brian handling some parental duties should make me happy. He rarely arranged evening outings with the kids. Normally, I'd be the one taking them to the park, the movies, or a friend's for a sleepover. But tonight, he had decided to prove he could be just as caring a father. Turning off the engine, I closed my eyes for a moment. Vivid images from earlier this evening flashed through my mind. Events I desperately wished I could erase. I could still feel the touch of my lover, Cole, lingering on my skin, and I tried to push down a rising sense of guilt. I deserve a little slice of happiness, I told myself, trying to justify it. Besides, Brian never asked too many questions, and it felt like I had everything under control. Walking into the house, I flinched at the silence. The living room was dark, though we usually kept a few lights on, so we wouldn't wander around in total darkness. For a second, it felt like I'd stepped into someone else's home. No kids laughing, no TV noise, no soft chatter. I set my purse on the shelf and flipped the switch. White walls reflected the overhead light too brightly, making the shadows look eerie. Seeing the empty couches and perfectly aligned, throw pillows gave me a chill. It was as though the house itself had turned away from me. I remembered Cole's sharp laugh whenever he commented on our family photos. Maybe you shouldn't keep these out in the open if you don't want your husband to suspect anything? I joked back then that Brian wasn't that observant. But now, standing in the darkness of our living room, I realized that my feeble excuses suddenly felt pathetic and worthless. My heart pounded with every memory of how I deceived Brian over the past few months. Awkward explanations for coming home late, work meetings, and last-minute errands at a friend's house. Did he really believe me, or was he just pretending? A tingling spread through my fingertips, a mix of panic and fear that his endless forgiveness might finally be running out. Climbing the stairs, I tried to convince myself everything was still fine. Maybe they'd gotten held up at some diner, and I was just imagining problems. I pushed open the bedroom door and saw that the bed had been neatly made, as if Brian had set it up that morning with textbook precision. That almost amused me. He was usually careless and messy. In the past, I'd have appreciated his effort, but now that tidy scene felt like a hostile sign, as though no one had lived in this house for ages. For a moment, a wild thought crossed my mind. What if Brian really figured out what was happening? What if he took the kids and simply isn't coming back? But that seemed absurd. I sat on the edge of the bed, pondered for a moment, and nearly laughed out loud. No, Brian had always been almost naively calm and more inclined to trust me than to demand explanations. If he had wanted to make a move, he would have done so already. I slipped out of my clothes and took a quick shower, then put on my favorite nightgown. Act like there's nothing unusual, I whispered to myself. After all, who would notice? Brian probably took the kids out to a diner, and maybe now they were standing in line for ice cream. I felt a cozy drowsiness, a faint leftover excitement from my evening with Cole, then climbed under the covers and drifted off without even turning off the bedside lamp. I was certain that in a couple of hours I'd be woken up by Connor bursting into the bedroom with his stories of a basketball game, or by Grace laughing and showing off her latest drawings to her dad. But that night, no one came, and the room remained lit by a cold, artificial glow. Thus, my firm belief that everything is still stable, despite the uneasy silence, ends. Deep down, though, I sensed that reality might unfold in a way I never expected. When I woke up, I knew immediately something was off. My hand automatically reached over to the other side of the bed, but there was no warmth or familiar sound of Brian breathing. I sat up, still half asleep, and noticed the pillow beside me wasn't even wrinkled. It was early morning, and the sun barely filtered through the thick curtains, leaving the room's edges blurry. It took me a few seconds to recall last night, coming home to a silent house, that unsettling stillness, the quick shower, and my frantic attempt to sleep, thinking Brian and the kids would walk in at any moment. But they hadn't returned. Honestly, I first thought it was a nightmare, because the idea of them just disappearing seemed unreal. But now I could no longer dismiss reality. I got up, threw on a long hoodie, and stepped into the hallway, peering into dim corners as though I might suddenly find my son or daughter there. Usually, Connor and Grace would be running around in the morning looking for backpacks or scattering their books, but today everything looked frozen, like a paused picture. I passed by the children's room, empty and haunting. Their blankets were pulled back neatly, their toys arranged in perfect lines. This was nothing like the everyday mess I was used to. My heart hammered in my chest. Silence had never felt so loud. I recalled how, just 2 nights before, when I was rushing to see Cole, the kids had begged me to stay home, but I'd used my usual excuse. Mommy has an important meeting. How trivial those late working hours and visits to a friend seemed now. If Brian really took them away for good, that would mean he had finally seen through my lies. A tightness gripped my chest, and I searched the house in a panic. The kitchen, living room, and bathroom, no sign of life. I grabbed my phone to call Brian, but a cold, automated message flashed on the screen. His number was unavailable. I tried calling the kids, but their phones didn't connect either. Each failure was another stab to my nerves. I decided to call my mother-in-law, Anna, hoping she might know what was happening. But the same recorded voice said the number was temporarily unavailable or blocked. My palms grew clammy, and I clung to any possible explanation. Maybe their phones broke? Or they were in some area without service. But even I knew that sounded weak. Desperate, I leaned toward the window to look outside. No sign of Brian or our family car. A wild thought flickered. Perhaps they went somewhere for breakfast, planning to surprise me? But I remembered Brian's pickup had been gone since last night. So I anxiously checked our closets. Brian's clothes were gone from his usual shelves, and half of the kids' clothes were missing from their drawers. People don't do that spontaneously. It meant he really left for the long term, on purpose. Wrapping the hoodie tighter around me, I walked into the kitchen and automatically reached for the coffee maker, hoping at least the sharp smell of coffee could bring some sanity back. But my gaze landed on a white envelope sitting by the coffee pot. Brian's wedding ring lay on top, catching the morning light with a cold glint. I froze, realizing this wasn't just a note reminding me to buy bread. I sat down, my hand trembling, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a typewritten letter, flawless, as if prepared in advance. The first lines hit me like a verdict. Megan, if you're reading this, then everything is already clear. It went on to say that Brian had taken the kids and that they were safe, far from your deceptions. It spelled out his plan to file for divorce, the evidence of my infidelity, and the fact that he no longer believed a single word I said. He expressed regret that our family was breaking apart, but insisted it was the only way. Seeing the phrase, another man, meaning Cole, cut me deeply, because up until then I'd convinced myself that no one suspected a thing. But Brian described several instances when I snuck away, leaving the kids unsupervised. He explained that he'd hired a private detective, collected enough incriminating material, and now intended to use it in court. I sat there, feeling numb, staring at the ring in front of me. Once it had symbolized trust, love, and peace. Now it stood for the disappearance of my family. My heart pounded as though it were trying to break out of my chest. I gripped the letter, feeling a dull ache, then grabbed my phone and tried dialing Brian again. But the automated message, "User unreachable," sounded like a final sentence. All I could do was look at the ring and reread each harsh paragraph where my husband made it clear that everything was over. I realized I'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. Seated at the kitchen table, I read Brian's letter over and over, each sentence feeling like a death sentence. In it, he explained in detail how he'd hired a private investigator and had long known about my affair with Cole. Apparently, he knew all about the times I disappeared under the guise of urgent meetings in another part of town. He knew about the lies I had showered on our kids. Mommy's away on a business trip. Mommy's visiting a friend in the hospital. Mommy's busy at work. All the while, he'd been gathering evidence against me, preparing for divorce. I came across a line where he said he could no longer tolerate my betrayal because, in his view, I hadn't just cheated on him. I'd abandoned our children. That realization hit me like a fever. Did my own kids really feel deserted? They called me every evening, but I'd shut off my phone, so no one would find out I was with Cole, then call them back only after returning home. How often had Grace cried when she couldn't hear my good night? How many times had Connor stumbled over questions to his father, asking why I was always busy? My eyes fell on Brian's wedding ring, still lying on the table. It once meant stability and security. I remembered our modest wedding, how we laughed at not being able to afford anything lavish, but felt we had each other's love. Now that single band remained like a hollow shell of a marriage stripped of all feeling and memory. A wave of guilt and dread about the future hit me so hard my hands went numb. Is this truly happening? I thought. Have I cornered myself to this extent? But the pain quickly turned to anger. Why didn't he say anything sooner? Why not give me a chance to explain? Maybe we could have resolved things without ruining the kids' lives. Yet deep down, I knew there was no defending myself. I'd allowed myself the luxury of ignoring my family while my children lived in the shadow of my constant excuses. Now payback had come. My mind raced, and I decided to try calling my mother-in-law, Anna. Although we were never really close, I hoped she might at least tell me where my children were. Placing the phone to my ear, I listened to it ring endlessly before clicking over to a short beep. Once again, the number was unavailable. Anna had always been Brian's main support, so perhaps she had helped him leave. I left a shaky-voiced message, even though I doubted she'd hear it if my number was blocked. Then I tried calling again. No luck. In a panic, I reread the last lines of Brian's letter. He demanded I not call or look for them, but go through his lawyer instead. A law firm's number was listed at the bottom, but I couldn't force myself to dial it. I felt the full weight of my life crumbling. With no answers forthcoming, my mind spiraled toward worst-case scenarios. What if Brian took the kids to another country? What if I never get a chance to speak to them again? Papers scattered around me, the remnants of our family life, lying in disarray. I realized I was now utterly alone. But one more thought nagged at me: Cole. To him, this entire situation was probably just an exciting little fling. He never imagined our meetings might unleash total destruction on my life. Maybe he didn't know Brian had bulletproof evidence. If Brian was taking action, Cole could also be in serious legal trouble. Suddenly, I understood that was exactly the case. Brian might hold Cole responsible for tearing our family apart. I stared at my phone. The only number I had left was Cole's, the only place I might find someone to listen. We'd never planned for a crisis like this. Our talks were all flirting and stolen moments. But now, maybe he was the only person who'd pick up. Through a haze of dread, I dialed his number. My fingers automatically punched in the familiar digits. One ring, then two, then three. I braced myself, ready for him not to answer or to hang up. But suddenly, a sleepy voice came through. "Hey, Megan, what's up?" For a second, I couldn't speak. My heart was beating like I'd just run a marathon. Finally, the words tumbled out. "Cole, Brian's gone, took the kids, and he's filing for divorce? He knows. He knows everything." I heard Cole sit up abruptly, his husky whisper carrying through the phone. Damn it, he couldn't have just disappeared. "Are you sure?" My words spilled out in a flood, begging him to come over, if only to stay with me. I'd never spoken to Cole in that tone before. No playful flirting, just raw desperation. He realized how serious it was and promised to leave right away. When the call ended, I knew my voice had sounded like a distress signal. I felt the walls closing in on me. I dreaded the knock at my door, from the process server delivering papers for the divorce suit and the potential lawsuit against both me and Cole. The idea was more terrifying than I'd ever imagined. I felt like I was drowning, grasping at Cole as my last straw. Deep down, however, I realized that even if he reached out to help, there'd be no hiding from the consequences. My betrayal was in the open, Brian was acting decisively, and the kids, they might already hate me. I squeezed the phone so tightly it nearly cracked. Tears burned my eyes, but I couldn't afford to collapse on the floor, sobbing. There were too many unanswered questions. Was Brian planning to take the kids across the country? Had he already filed in court, working on removing me from their lives completely? A buzzing emptiness flooded my head. I got up from the table, walked into the living room, and just stood there, feeling the cold air swirl around me. It dawned on me that my fear was rapidly swallowing up my last faint hope that everything would work out. No, it wouldn't anymore. Monday morning, I arrived at work clutching a feeble hope that maybe all this was just a nightmare, something that would vanish once I focused on everyday tasks. My office was on the 13th floor of a glass high-rise, and I usually loved the view. Toy-like cars, crowds moving along sidewalks with coffee cups and endless skies. But today, stepping into the lobby felt like my heart dropped into my stomach. People seemed unnaturally loud. They were greeting each other, whispering in corners, some even laughing. Maybe they had no clue that my life was shattering. In the elevator, I held my laptop bag as my fingers trembled slightly. I tried to concentrate on a checklist, check my email, finalize a report, host a quick sales meeting. But each item echoed hollowly through my head, not triggering any real response. When the elevator reached my floor, I stepped out and saw my coworker, Terry, wearing a worried expression. We used to go to lunch together and share office gossip. But now she looked like someone trying to warn me of an oncoming storm. She opened her mouth, seemingly to offer me some encouragement, but said nothing. I had a wild thought. Do they all already know? No sooner had I approached my workstation than I noticed a stranger in a gray suit standing there. He held a folder bound neatly with a rubber band, staring at me with a blank expression. For a moment, I didn't understand what was happening, but then I recognized the unsettling legal stamps on the cover. "Are you Megan Harper?" he asked. Yes, my voice was louder than I intended, sharp with tension. All conversations around the open office ceased, and co-workers gathered at a distance, pretending to look busy. The man handed me some papers and, in a loud, firm voice, announced, "You are formally notified of a divorce filing by your spouse." I froze. No sugarcoating, just a blunt fact. He had served me the divorce papers in front of my colleagues. My horror reached a new level. Lips pressed together, I took the documents, struggling to maintain some composure. The man turned and walked away, as if he'd just finished a routine task. A second later, the onlookers scattered, some whispering, others dropping their gaze to avoid my eyes. Inside, I heard only the thrum of blood in my ears and my chaotic thoughts. Brian has gone all in. The kids, divorce, cheating, lawyers. Glancing at the top page, I saw the heading, Harper versus Harper. The complaints spelled out allegations of adultery and neglect of parental duties. My knees wobbled, fighting off the urge to have a meltdown. I hurried to my cramped little office, slammed the door, and sank into my chair, clutching the folder of documents to my stomach. My first impulse was to call Brian, begging him to drop everything. But I'd already tried. His number was disconnected. He blocked me on social media, and every attempt to contact him hit a wall of silence. The next thought was to call his lawyer, whose details I'd found in his letter. The idea of talking to a lawyer who represented the man taking my children away made my skin crawl, but I felt cornered. I had to do something. I flipped through the pages, found the law firm's number, and dialed on my cell. They picked up almost immediately. Carter Law Office, hello. The tone was extremely polite, yet cold. When I introduced myself, the voice changed slightly. "Ms. Harper, Mr. Carter is currently unavailable, but he wanted me to inform you that all inquiries regarding your divorce case should be submitted in writing." "Wait," I began, fighting the quiver in my voice. "I have a lot of questions. I need to know where my kids are. Please send your questions to Mr. Carter by email." The voice continued dispassionately. "He will call you back if necessary." Then the line went dead. I exhaled sharply, as if I had just run a sprint. My hands were shaking, and I stared at the papers where the charges against me were spelled out in black and white. They detailed instances of me leaving town while the kids supposedly needed a mother's care. And the mention of my affair with Cole twisted my insides in knots. Brian's lawyer planned to attach the private detective's statement and other materials. I didn't even want to imagine what else was out there. I realized that to them, I wasn't a mother, but some callous creature who didn't care about her kids. Worse, if they had evidence I spent entire weekends with Cole while telling the kids, "Mommy's away on business." My credibility in court was practically zero. A knock at my door told me someone had come in. It was Terry. She quietly took a seat across from me and whispered, "Megan, I'm sorry. I don't know what to say." She tried to take my hand. I pulled away, not because I was mad at her, but because shame and humiliation flooded over me. I couldn't believe this was happening in real life. My colleagues would now be gossiping the moment I was out of earshot. My marriage and reputation were crashing in front of everyone, and the most painful part was that I brought it on myself. "I just wanted to say," Terry continued, "maybe you should take a day off or a short leave?" "Yeah, maybe I will," I mumbled, cursing myself for my total lack of control. She left, and I remained alone in my tiny office, feeling like every bridge behind me was burning. The folder on my lap felt as heavy as a boulder, and a single thought pounded in my head. Brian will see this through, and I'm not sure I'll ever be able to rebuild a relationship with the kids. Right then, I felt humiliation, not as a passing blow, but as a reality I'd have to live in. In one short morning, my pride had vanished, leaving only confusion and a terrible emptiness in its place. When I got home after a grueling workday, a new kind of emptiness washed over me. Before, the house would greet me with children's laughter or the smell of dinner, but now the silence felt like a museum where every object was foreign. I absent-mindedly checked the mailbox and found a few envelopes. Mixed in with the usual bills was a letter with no return address, my own address scrawled in large, sweeping letters. Once inside, I set the mail on the kitchen table and took off my coat, sensing my anxiety flare again. Slitting open the anonymous envelope, I pulled out a sheet of paper filled with brief, cutting text. It turned out to be from Anna, Brian's mother, technically my mother-in-law, though we were in the midst of divorce proceedings. In it, Anna wrote that she no longer wished to communicate with me and didn't want me calling her or any other family member to find Brian. She said he had already left with the kids, Connor and Grace, to a faraway place overseas, where he'd landed a coveted position as the head of a major company's branch. Finally, in a cold tone, she declared they would never forgive me for my deceptions and disregard for the children. Breathing became difficult. My thoughts careened. So Brian actually pulled off an international move to Australia? That quickly? Now Connor and Grace are with him on the other side of the world, and I have no clue how to get them back. I reread the letter's last line about how my lies had already destroyed the family, over and over until the words blurred before my eyes. I tried to calm myself, folding the letter carefully, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I put the kettle on and started thinking about how, ever since Brian took the kids, I'd been grasping for any clue that could lead me to get Connor and Grace back. But this letter was no such clue. It seemed more like a warning to stay away from them. My tablecloth wrinkled beneath my clenched fists, and warm memories of the past flashed in my mind. How Brian and I once laughed about the world being too big to stay home. How Connor used to draw silly faces on greeting cards, and how Grace held picnics in our living room. Now they were gone, and I was stuck here with my regrets. Determined to do something, I spread out the legal documents I'd received earlier. They indicated Brian was accusing me of neglect, saying I left the kids with neighbors or his mother while disappearing for evenings on end, presumably with Cole. Even though I knew I was guilty, reading it felt far worse. Now that Brian had moved Connor and Grace thousands of miles away, out of my reach. To clarify things, I called the lawyer I'd hired when I first got served. He didn't pick up at first, so I left an urgent message. Minutes dragged on before he finally called back, his voice detached. "Yes, Megan, I got your note and your call. Sorry for the delay." "Do you know Brian took the kids to Australia?" I asked, struggling not to break down. "Yes, I've heard. According to the paperwork, he's already registering their residence there. This complicates the case." The word complicates stung like a slap, because if I wanted to challenge custody or even see the kids again, I'd need to wade into international legal proceedings with money I definitely didn't have. Plus, there was the risk they'd conclusively prove my wrongdoing. Hanging up, I looked again at Anna's letter. A pang hit my chest. I'd once viewed her almost like a second mother, a loving grandmother to my children. Now her words cut like ice. I sank to the floor, wrapping my arms around my head. I wanted to call Connor and Grace just to hear their voices, but their numbers were all disconnected. Brian had changed their SIM cards or blocked me. Tears stung my eyes, but I fought the urge to sob, knowing it wouldn't change a thing. I understood that, having left the country, they were far beyond my immediate reach. I couldn't just fly over and snatch them back. My new reality was that I'd become the woman who'd lost the right to be called a mother. All that remained was heartbreak, guilt, and a faint notion that I had to fight anyway, even if my chances were slim. Glancing around the room, I felt its empty walls closing in on me. This house, once filled with children's laughter, was now like a stone prison. I realized I had nowhere else to go. My life was unraveling right here, in front of the framed photographs and dusty books. By then, the kettle was cold, untouched. I stared at it and grasped a harsh truth. Brian had followed through on his promise to protect the children from me, and now the only path to them might be through official lawyers or, in a miracle, a phone call. But even their numbers were hidden beyond my reach. That ended my last flicker of hope. Anna's letter had arrived merely to finalize this blow. Everything I believed in now felt permanently lost. And instead of maybe I can still save our family, I was seized by the terrible realization that my kids might be gone from my life forever. My lawyer told me Brian had not only solid grounds for the divorce, but also a strong case against my lover. An absurd idea flitted through my mind. Should I run to Cole for help? I knew many people already saw me as the family traitor, especially Brian's mother, Anna, and everyone who'd known me before. But Cole still felt like a safe haven from guilt and pain. I started spending more time at his place, seeking solitude and a clue to handle the wreck my life had become. One day, while we were sitting on a stuffy couch in that tiny apartment, I finally confessed how terrified I was of losing everything: my children, my sense of self, any scrap of hope of getting Connor and Grace back. Cole wrapped his arm around me, insisting that things would sort themselves out, and I needed to move forward. He then abruptly proposed. I almost choked on my own breath. After my entire family life with Brian collapsed, the idea of remarrying felt absurd. Still, the notion of a fresh start, an escape from my past, was tempting. I wavered, but Cole assured me that legally it would be easier to protect ourselves if we were a team. I eventually gave in and said yes, though deep down my doubts gnawed at me. Maybe it was fear of being alone, or maybe I wanted to believe a second union could redeem me. When I told my friend Terry, she looked at me like I was crazy, but said nothing, knowing I wouldn't change my mind. Cole and I began our so-called married life without a ceremony or rings, except for signing documents in a drab municipal corridor with chipped paint. None of my family was there, and apparently he had no one on his side either. He mentioned he'd moved here after serious conflicts in his own family and rarely kept in touch with them. For the first few weeks, I lived like I was in a fog. We ate cheap pizza, stayed up late watching TV, and tried not to think about the court summons and legal battles. My feelings for Cole were complicated. I felt despair, gratitude, attachment, but not the pure love you see in stable relationships. Deep down, I knew my heart was drained by guilt, worry for my children, and the looming dread of what the future might hold. Meanwhile, Brian's lawyer kept sending letters and notices about every new phase in the case. They were bent on proving me guilty of adultery and neglect toward Connor and Grace, and they planned to sue Cole for alienation of affection or intentionally destroying my family. Whenever I showed Cole these documents, he pretended not to care, just frowning and mumbling, "They won't prove a thing. Don't worry." But one evening, I noticed his phone buzzing nonstop, and Cole looked anxious, refusing to pick up. That alarmed me. We used to share everything, or so I thought. When I gently asked, he brushed me off. "It's nothing. A friend's in trouble. I don't want you involved." His evasive eyes suggested he was hiding something. In that moment, I recognized the same tone I'd used with Brian when I was making excuses for my secret meetups. About a month into our marriage, the sense of unease never left me. Cole was disappearing at night. For business I shouldn't know about. I feared I might end up in the same role I'd put Brian in, deceived and left behind. After my first marriage collapsed and my kids moved abroad, I felt more vulnerable than ever. One dreary, rainy evening, I returned to Cole's place with a heavy bag of groceries, hoping to cook us a warm, homey dinner I'd missed for so long. But outside his building, I saw flashing police lights and a small crowd gathering. I stopped in my tracks as two bodies were carried out on stretchers covered by black plastic. I learned Cole and another woman had been caught by her enraged husband, who came armed. In a blind rage, he opened fire, killing them both instantly. The news hit me like a bullet. I watched the ambulance load the victims, rain mixing with the tears on my face. A police officer asked for my ID and explained what happened. I sat in a squad car answering questions. In that moment, I felt hollow, shock, despair, and fear all colliding at once. It turned out Cole had been living a double life, which ultimately ended him. That night was the final blow to my illusions. I realized I'd tried to start over with someone who wasn't all that different from me at my worst. It ended in tragedy, leaving me alone without the faintest chance of getting my children back or healing my shattered soul. A few months have passed since Cole died. Sometimes I feel like I'm looking at my life from the outside, as if it's someone else's tragedy, not mine. When I wake up, I half expect to hear Connor or Grace's voices, but the house remains cold and empty. I won't pretend I've moved on smoothly. Some days I can't even force myself out of bed. To distract myself, I quit my old job and found work at a small agency doing administrative tasks. No one there knows my history. If anyone suspects, they don't ask. I needed anonymity, even if it was only partial, because you can't truly hide in a small city. After work, I come back to a tiny rental apartment with just the bare necessities. I sold most of my possessions to pay off debts, and the wedding photos with Brian, along with the kids' pictures, are boxed away under the bed. Looking around that pitiful living space, I realize I've fallen so far. I'm not sure I'll ever stand up again. Even worse is the thought that Connor and Grace, now living in Australia, probably never give me a second thought. One evening, I got an email from an old acquaintance named Leslie, who used to work with me and Brian. She said she'd come across him by chance at an online conference about expanding business overseas. He'd been one of the speakers, and Leslie was struck by how confident and happy he seemed. But the most painful part of her email was this: Brian wasn't alone. He was there with someone named Hannah, introduced as his fiancée. Leslie described Hannah as a cheerful blonde with a soft voice and warm smile. Rumor had it Hannah had gone through a tough divorce herself, and she and Brian bonded over shared experiences. I reread Leslie's message several times, struggling to believe my ex-husband had so quickly built a new life while I kept sinking deeper into my mistakes. It seemed everything in Melbourne had gone perfectly for him: career, kids, and a new love who was likely much better for him than I'd ever been. That evening, I left my apartment just to clear my head, and I noticed a photo studio displaying happy family portraits in its window. Without thinking, I pictured Brian, Connor, Grace, and Hannah posing together as a beaming family. It tore me apart. Yet deep inside, I also felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe he truly was happy now, and the kids had found a motherly warmth I couldn't give them. A few days later, I mustered the courage to call Grace's old phone number just to hear it ring. As before, there was no answer. I kept the line open, as if hoping for a miracle. Trying Connor's number went the same way. Silence. I realized they likely had new numbers and were fully engrossed in new lives. I checked their social media profiles. Nothing, all set to private or long abandoned. A familiar sorrow set in, the feeling that they had simply forgotten me. Then again, I had set this path in motion by choosing Cole and pushing the kids aside. Staring at my phone, I felt that despite the pain and jealousy, I had no right to blame Brian for trying to give the children a stable family with someone else. I remembered how I'd spent months hiding from him, leaving the kids confused by my constant absences. I once felt justified seeking happiness on the side, and now it was all coming back to haunt me. Standing by the window, watching the sunset, I realized I could keep nursing resentment toward Hannah, or try something constructive. Maybe I needed to focus on bettering myself, clawing my way out of the hole, sorting out the legal chaos, paying off debts, and holding on to hope that one day my kids might read my letters, even if they never replied. About 2 weeks passed after I learned from Leslie that Brian was engaged to Hannah, and everything in their world seemed perfect. In that time, I argued with my lawyer twice because he insisted, "Megan, face reality. If you want any reunion with your kids, you'll have to go through a mountain of paperwork and, at best, get short visits." He urged me not to try any stunts like flying overseas unannounced, but I stubbornly kept sending letters to Connor and Grace at the old Australian address I discovered in Brian's paperwork. I had no clue if these letters reached them. Brian might have moved with Hannah and never shared his new address. Still, I sealed the envelopes and mailed them, sending my desperation out into the void. Then, one evening, I was at the laundromat, waiting for the washing machine to finish when my friend Terry called. She sounded tense but measured. "Don't panic," she said, "but I'm on some forum for traveling parents, and I think there's a post from your kids." My heart skipped a beat. It turned out Grace, under the username GraceHarper13, had written about how tough it was adjusting to her new school and how her mom, Hannah, was trying to help with homework, but she still missed her old friends and, at times, the life she'd had before Australia. Terry sent me a screenshot, and I stood there in that cavernous, humming space clinging to my phone like a life preserver. "Mom, Hannah," that phrase stung like a burn. So Grace had accepted Hannah as her mother and publicly called her Mom. I confess I burst into tears right then. It wasn't that Hannah's presence in the kids' lives surprised me. I knew she was more than just Dad's girlfriend. Yet seeing it laid out on a forum by Grace herself felt like a stab to the heart. My little girl, who used to adore our ice cream trips, was now turning to another woman for guidance and comfort, and I couldn't blame her. To compose myself, I went to a nearby cafe and ordered the strongest coffee I could get. I sat there trying to gather my thoughts. From Grace's viewpoint, I'd checked out of her world long ago. Brian had stepped up, investing time and love in their upbringing, while I'd lost them along with everything else, and yet a strange flicker of hope lingered. Grace was writing online about her life, meaning maybe I could reach out. If she was posting under that username, I might find her profile and send a private message. My fingers shook as I scrolled on my phone, searching for the parents' forum Terry mentioned, entering Grace Harper 13, and the site name. I found a thread where teens talked about moving abroad, new schools, how to make friends quickly. Nestled among tips and stories was Grace's comment. My heart raced when I read how she mentioned Mom Hannah. Scrolling down, I found another line. "It would be nice if my biological parent hadn't backed away from me, or honestly, I'm not sure what I want." Those words seemed aimed right at me. On impulse, I created a username, Megan_R, intending to respond. But what would I even say? Hi, I'm your real mom. Or pretend to be just a friendly stranger offering advice. My hands trembling, I typed a message to show I cared, hinting that I knew her. But after reading it over, I deleted everything. Several agonizing minutes later, I closed the browser. I wasn't ready to blindside my daughter with a confession on the internet. Later that night, back home, I reread the old letters I'd written to Connor and Grace. Letters full of apologies and proclamations of love, none of which got an answer. Suddenly, I realized I needed to tell my daughter and my son that I wasn't trying to take away their new family or their new mom. I just wanted them to remember I still exist. I spent that night typing a long post on my computer and finally worked up the nerve to put it on the forum under Megan_. I'm not sure if you'll see this, Grace. I wrote, but I don't want to tear apart your new life. I only want you to know I'll always care about your ups and downs. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. If Hannah cares for you like her own child, I'm grateful. But if you ever want to talk to me, I'll be here. Waiting. Fear racked my body as I clicked send. Maybe Grace would see my post as an intrusion, or maybe she'd ignore it. But I had to make at least this one gesture. No confrontations, no accusations toward Brian or Hannah. Just a statement that I hadn't vanished from the face of the earth. In doing so, I placed a virtual period on the perspective I'd held until now. I was finally acknowledging that Hannah was a genuine pillar in my kids' lives, and perhaps truly a second mom. If Connor and Grace had accepted her, she was part of their family circle. As for me, their biological mother, I would take a different approach, attempt to win back their trust, or at least earn a place in their memories. Coincidences are strange. Honestly, I never thought I'd see Brian or our kids in person again. But life decided otherwise. My boss assigned me to a short conference in Denver where I was to present a brief report on planning advertising campaigns, a supposed good chance to boost the agency's reputation. Ironically, I had plenty of personal worries overshadowing any presentation. Sleepless nights wondering if Connor or Grace would ever see my letters or if they'd respond. Dragging my suitcase into the hotel, exhausted from multiple flights, I was sure the world revolved around my obligations and misery. Then, stepping into the spacious lobby, I nearly tripped when I recognized a familiar figure at the registration desk. It was Brian wearing one of his usual dark suits, the same style he used back home. Next to him stood a slim woman with wavy blonde hair, presumably that Hannah Leslie had told me about. And beside them were two teens gazing at the decorative fountains in the lobby. I recognized them instantly, without a doubt, my kids Connor and Grace. My hands started to shake. The fact that we somehow ended up in the same hotel, thousands of miles from our old home, felt surreal. Part of me wanted to rush to them, but a voice in my head cautioned, "What if they don't want to see you?" Seconds later, Brian turned around, and our eyes met. Tension flickered across his face. Leaning over, he whispered something to Hannah, who nodded and guided the kids toward the elevators. My heart pounded. It was as if I was reliving the pain and humiliation of being shut out of their new life. Still, I managed to move forward, though my legs felt leaden. Just then Brian came toward me, as if realizing we couldn't avoid each other, and there was no point hiding. We stopped near a guest couch, trying not to make a scene. I tasted the bitter tang of lost love and the sting of deep disappointment. "Hey," I finally said. My voice sounded like it was coming from the depths of an empty well. "Hey," he replied curtly, glancing around like he was worried people might be watching. A year ago, I might have thrown myself at him, begging forgiveness, but I had no idea what to say now. I asked how the kids were, hoping for a sign of warmth. Brian frowned. They're fine. We're here briefly so I can meet with investors, and Connor's checking out a local academy. They like Australia. They've adjusted to school, a new environment. We all have. His use of "we" felt like a marker that they'd formed a new family unit without me. Part of me wanted to ask about Grace, how she got along with Hannah, but my throat tightened. I could see Brian bracing himself, worried I'd start an argument. I I don't want to fight, I said, forcing a shaky smile. I'm just glad to see you, even if it's a surprise. He glanced away for a moment, then looked back and spoke softly. I know this is hard for you, but you need to understand. The kids had a rough time after everything fell apart. They've grown used to Hannah. She's become a good mother to them. I'm not trying to erase their memories of you, but things have changed. His words were like needles piercing my heart. Indeed, Hannah was now their good mother. So what was I? Brian's eyes held a mixture of pity and resolve. He didn't want to hurt me more, but he also couldn't let me invade their new life. I noticed Connor edging closer. Maybe he'd come to get his dad, but then he saw me and froze. We used to be so close he'd still call me Mom, even in his teens. Now he looked at me like I was a stranger. Hey, Connor, I said, nervously tucking my hair behind my ear. I miss you. How are you? I'm good, he replied quietly, his voice tinged with a slight Australian accent. I guess I'm glad to see you. I wanted to hug him, but he stood still. It seemed he didn't know how to respond. Meanwhile, Grace hovered behind Hannah, holding her hand. When our gazes met, my daughter quickly turned away. My world cracked apart. Hannah, noticing my pain, leaned in and whispered something soothing to Grace, who nodded. Kids, let's go, Brian said softly, casting me a guarded farewell glance. Megan, we're in a hurry. Right, was all I managed. I don't want to hold you up. I hope someday I'll hear from you. They didn't answer. Together they walked toward the elevator, and I stood in the lobby, my heart pounding and a cold wave washing over me. A few seconds later, the elevator doors slid shut behind them. I had an urge to run after them, shouting that I still loved my children, that I regretted every day we'd been apart. But I knew they had a new world now, one where I was an unwelcome outsider. Slowly, I headed to my hotel room, staring at my reflection in the mirrored elevator walls. My face showed loss, a look I'd seen so many times over the last few years. Yet deep inside, I felt that even this painful encounter had reminded me I am still their mother. Even if our contact is reduced to rare letters, I have to keep fighting for the bond that once made us a real family. Sometimes the end is just the beginning of something even more thrilling. Click to discover the next story. You won't want to miss it.